do not deserve God's favor or goodness towards us. We don't deserve even to breathe in this breath that we are taking right now. We as people think we deserve a lot. We get entitled in life. And it's good to remember to be humbled and to remember that God is the one showing us grace. And that we didn't earn it. We're not good people. It's nothing that Jesus didn't come and die for you and me because we were worth it on our own. He died for you and me because that's his character. It's a character of love. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, but before we begin, as always, I would like to personally go to the Lord and ask his help, that he would give me words to speak, that I would communicate well, and that you would be blessed in hearing the word. Let's go to the Lord. Our Father, we thank you for your grace. We humble ourselves before you and admit we do not deserve it. And as I stand here, I am reminded of your grace, and I am humbled at the opportunity to speak your words after you. I pray that you would give me strength, that you would give me wisdom, that your word would go forth and that hearts would be changed because of the power of your Holy Spirit. I pray that you would be with each of us today, that you would call us deeper into a knowledge of you and into relationship with your Son, Jesus Christ. It's in his name that we pray these things. Amen. As a child, I didn't know as much as I know today. And one of the things I learned as a child was there are a lot of words I don't know what they mean. There are a lot of things in life I don't know what to call them yet. And unfortunately, one of these words got me a nickname. And it was a nickname I didn't like because it reminded me of my failure and my ignorance. Once my uncles came, they didn't live near us at the time, but they came to the family land that we lived on. And they brought a tractor. And my dad had a tractor, and I kind of grew up around tractors and knew them. And they needed a part for a tractor. And they finally called on me to be involved and to help. And they said, Ethan, we need you to run and get a clevis. Now, some of you are farmers, you know what a clevis is. There are a few who may not know. I thought I knew, but I didn't know. And they told me it was a part that you put on the drawbar to be able to pull things with. And I thought of a pin, a straight pin that you would stick in a trailer. And so I ran and grabbed the pin. It was pretty far away. They were at my grandmother's house, and I went up to my dad's house, and it probably took me 20 minutes to run between there and back. And I brought back the wrong part. And much to my chagrin, they laughed at me. And they said, that's not a clevis. And a clevis, if you don't know, I'm sure some of you are curious now, it's more like a horseshoe with a pin that usually you can screw into place, and it locks this loop on a drawbar. And I didn't know what I was looking for. I thought I did. I made some assumptions, and I was completely wrong. So after that, my uncles called me Clevis, which I did not enjoy, because it constantly reminded me of a failure, of something I didn't know. It also was a weird hick name to me, Clevis. So maybe you know. Have any of you ever known somebody named Clevis? Good. We didn't offend anybody today. So that failure in my life gave me a name. It wasn't a name I enjoyed. And I think sometimes in life we can assume we know things. There are words words and ideas that, oh yeah, everybody knows what that means. And we need to be really careful because there are specific definitions for words that mean specific things. And today we're going to see in Philippians chapter 1 that there is actually a definer of words. And our job is not to define things. It's actually just to approve what is already defined. You see, if you probably saw in your bulletin, the sermon today is approving excellence. We're going to see in Philippians chapter 1 how if you don't want to get a nickname that you're not real proud of, you might want to be careful. You need to allow the thing to be called what it's called and not rename it. If everybody could just bring a drawbar pin and say, well, okay, that's a clevis now, then our world would be in chaos. Everything would change, and it would be dependent on what each of us thinks is a clevis. And if my uncles actually want a clevis, and they're calling it one thing, and I'm calling it something else, we're never going to be on the same page, and we're not going to be able to cooperate. And today we're going to see in Philippians 1 something that we need to be careful about how we specifically define it. We started in Philippians in chapter 2, and I did that on purpose because the letter of Philippians is meant to be read as one whole thing. And if you read it in one big flow, you get to chapter 2 really quickly, and you can connect it immediately back to chapter 1 and back forward to chapter 3 and chapter 4, and it fits in the middle as a perfect linchpin for all the ideas that are going on. So we started in chapter 2 to kind of lay the foundation. And if you may remember last week, the call was to have this attitude in yourselves, which is also in Jesus Christ. This is chapter 2, verse 5. Verse 6 says, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. And remember, we talked about that equality as being what Eve actually grasped for. The ability to define for herself good and evil. She actually wanted to be equal with God. Jesus lays that down. And instead, he submits himself to the Father. It says in verse 7, he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. And being found as a man, he humbled himself. How far did he humble himself? By becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And remember last week we talked about that death was not just a death, but it was a cursed death. It was the very thing that we would always call evil. All Jewish people would define this type of death as evil, cursed of God. And yet God says this is good and right for Jesus Christ. So Jesus humbles himself enough to allow God to define good in his life and what is best. And we're going to see that again in chapter 1. We'll go ahead and read through chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The Bible tells us that the word, all of Scripture is profitable for us. And while we won't focus on every verse, we'll go ahead and read every verse. There may be some profit for you this morning in some things that we don't focus on. So let's read together verses 1 through 11. Please follow along in your copy of God's Word. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, including the overseers and deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all, in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now. For I am confident in this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. For it is only right for me to feel this way about you all, because I have you in my heart, since both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are partakers of grace with me. For God is my witness, how I long for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in real knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve the things that are excellent, in order to be sincere and blameless until the day of Christ, having been filled with the fruit of righteousness which comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. As we read this, we're reminded that this is a letter, an actual letter from Paul to the church at Philippi. And he addresses some of the people there, the overseers. We might call them bishops or elders. There's different words often used for that same role in the church. And he addresses the deacons. And then he gives thanks, and he talks to them about praying for them. And the one thing he says here that I think we can land on is the verse we've heard. I am confident in this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Jesus Christ. I want to spend a little time talking about that. Often this verse is quoted for all those who go to church, or all those who call themselves Christians. And I want to caution us against that. If you see why he says it's good for him to say that, it's because they've participated through some hard things. They've kept going already. They participated in the gospel in the middle of imprisonment. They participated as he had to defend what he was saying while he was on trial for the gospel. They've helped defend the gospel from outside attack and influence who wanted to change the gospel. They've helped defend it by being in prison themselves and being under attack by the Romans, who didn't like that there was this king who is victorious other than Caesar. And so they've already gone through a lot. And he says this about these saints because of their perseverance, because of their willingness to defend the gospel at all costs. And I don't want to give you a false sense of security about if God's going to perfect the work in your life. God's grace is there for all of us. But it's not a certainty that we will accept it and receive it and that we will continue in it. You see, in the parable of the sower, Jesus tells us something that's actually a little scary. He says the gospel is spread out and it lands on people different ways. And they're like different soil. And in some cases, it springs up right away and it has great life and it just keeps growing. And it actually does produce fruit. And it keeps going even when the thorns come. And it keeps going even when the birds come. And it keeps going. But you see, that's only one type of soil. And that's the type of soil he's talking about. That's the type of soil that God's going to perfect the work until the end. He's going to allow the plan of the gospel to work out to complete fruition in someone's life because they're that type of soil. Unfortunately, in the parable of the sower, there are other types of soil. There are types of soil where the gospel springs up, but it didn't really get a good solid root. Somebody grabs a hold of it and says, yeah, I like that. And then hard times come, and it withers and it dies, and it never bears any fruit in the life. It doesn't go to fruition. It doesn't go to completion. There are other soil where the birds come and they grab it, or the thorns come and they choke it out. And any of you who've ever grown a garden, you've experienced this with your plants. If you don't go pull those morning glories up, what happens? They start to wrap around and strangle the plants. pretty soon that plant doesn't have enough energy to even produce much fruit. You might get some little stunted thing. So just like that, the gospel has different soil that it lands on in our lives. And for those who endure, for those who push through the hard times and hold on to their faith, God is going to complete the work. You can have confidence that he's going to continue and continue to work in that life and to change it more and more to be like him. And that one day, that life will look exactly like Jesus Christ. And he's going to complete the work in that person's life. And that's my hope for every life I come in contact with. I act as if that's what God's going to do. God is going to complete his work in you. All you have to do is have faith. All you have to do is keep trusting. Don't let the cares of the world crush your faith. Don't let the other things in life that come steal your faith. Don't let somebody come alongside you and say, hey, you know what? That's not true. This is true. Because what you find is people say, okay, yeah, I believe that's true now. And their faith is dead. Never bears any fruit. It never goes anywhere. And so Paul is saying about the Philippians, I am confident about this for you because I have seen the fruit. I have seen how much you love the gospel, how much you participate in it. I have seen this bear out in your life, and I am confident, and I can say this without any doubt. God is going to complete this. He is going to perfect you one day fully. You will be just like Jesus Christ. If you desire that for your life, you've got to persevere. You've got to hold on to your faith. Day after day, you have to confess, Jesus is my answer. Jesus, death was for me. I am accepted. We'll go on here in Philippians and we'll see there's actually more we can do. If you are confident in the gospel, if your faith and dependence is in God, there's more. Let's keep reading. He says that he goes over his longing for them, his love for them, specifically because they are participants. They're brothers in the gospel. They're co-laborers. They have fellowship, intimate fellowship around this truth. And then in verse 9, he says, this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in real knowledge and all discernment. Here's the clevis. Here's the part that we need to be careful about. Love. Many of us think we know what love is. Some of us, it's kind of a fuzzy idea. Some of us, it's these fuzzy feelings we get when we see the boy or the girl. That's love. Oh, I can't wait till I fall in love. We need to be careful that we're not calling something that it's not. That's not what love is. Here, the word, you've probably heard it before, and I don't like to kill you with Greek, but it's the word agape. It is a selfless to death love. It is the love that Jesus showed us on the cross. It's the type of love that means you take up your cross daily for somebody else. It is a love that means I choose someone else's betterment over my own. Even if it means I die. It brings a little bit different spin on love. It's not just niceties and goodness and kindness. Those are all parts of it. And one of the things I love about the word love is when you look at God's character, every aspect of who he is can actually be connected back to love. We talked about grace this morning. You don't deserve it, but you're given it. That's love. That's selfless love. What about mercy? Mercy means you're withheld what you actually deserve. That's love. What about kindness or goodness? What about the way he's faithful? That's love. What about speaking the truth? That's love. That's love worked out in very specific areas, in more defined ways. What other things do you know about God? He's just. This is the one we often have trouble with. How could a loving God send people to hell? That's love. You understand it. If you saw a just judge sitting on the throne and letting rapists go free with no consequence, what would you say? You'd scream and shout. You'd be making a fuss on Facebook. You'd post it. You'd say, this is terrible. This is injustice. You see, the consequences of not being like that perfect love of God means that he has to judge. And that's loving for him to judge. What's even more loving is he provided a way to have mercy and grace in the midst of his judgment. You see, there is no part of God that is not love. There is no part of his character, there is no part of him that is not love. We appreciate it coming at us, but sometimes we suffer showing it out towards others. The Apostle John, it's written that he retired to Ephesus. So the church at Ephesus was his home church. He was the bishop over those churches. And it was during that time that he was eventually exiled to the island of Patmos, which is right off the coast of Ephesus. You can actually see the ships coming in from Patmos. You can see the people on the road going into Ephesus. And it was torture for him to be that close and not be able to see that. It was kind of like what we're going through. Like out in the parking lot, you could see, hey, at least there you could talk a little bit. But for John, he loved Christians. And it was during that time he wrote the Revelation of Jesus Christ, the last book in our Bible. And as he got older, he lost the use of his legs. And they would carry him to church. And he lost the ability to speak much. But he was recorded as always saying, little children, love one another. Little children, love one another. He just mumbled it nonstop. Little children, love one another. He was asked to get up and speak at one of the gatherings as he was getting older. And that's all he said. Love one another. And I said, well, you were with the Lord. Surely you have more to give us. Give us more. Give us more. He said, this is enough. This is all you need. Love one another. The problem is when you get the word love wrong. If you don't understand love and the defining of love, then that sentence can mean anything you want in this world. And the way John was defining love was God. God's character. God. Be like God to one another. You see, God is love. And he's not your version of love. He's his version of love. He gets to define what love is. Unfortunately, love is convenient for us today. Love is when I get what I need out of the relationship. Love is my needs being met, not other people's needs being met. And so when you get to verse 9, and Paul writes, I pray that your love may abound still more and more in real knowledge and all discernment. He's not talking about your ability to know what's good and evil, what's real love. He's talking about you knowing the source of real love. He says in real knowledge. This real knowledge is often used in the rest of the New Testament as knowing God. You see, it is impossible for you to live up to the standard of God and real love without knowing God, without being exposed to God. As you go on here, here's why. Verse 10. So that you may approve the things that are excellent, in order to be sincere and blameless until the day of Christ, having been filled with the fruit of righteousness, which comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So here's how it works. Here's the whole plan. God is the perfect definition of humanity. We're made in his image. He has defined love and how we are to exist in himself. And for you to know how you exist, for you to know how you're supposed to interact with each other, you have to know this definition. And you have to know him intimately. You have to know him inside and out. You have to believe that he is. You have to believe everything he says about himself. The problem is, God's kind of this ethereal idea in many of our minds. Right? He's this grand white bearded guy in the sky. And for a lot of people, he is a judge who's just ready to strike us down with lightning when we make a mistake. For others, he's just disengaged and he doesn't care. And he just is over there doing his thing while we're over there doing our thing. The Bible gives us a different reality. He says that there is this perfect, loving, good God that desires for us to know him and be in relationship with him, to be dependent on him as a good and loving Father. And he understood this divide because we left his definition. We said, I'd rather choose for myself what I want to be like. I'd rather choose for myself what is good and evil in my life. What is loving and not loving. What is kind and not kind. What's grace and mercy. And we come up with our own definitions. And we think we're doing pretty good by our standards. And the whole time, the Bible calls it sin. No matter how good somebody looks, no matter how good they look in your definition or my definition, if they are not exactly like the definition, they're sinning. And this is the thing that has caused each of us to be under God's judgment. Because even the best that we do, according to the standard, looks disgusting. It's foul. It's gross. Not in our judgment, but in the true judge and the standard's judgment. And he sees us hurting each other. He sees us hurting ourselves. He sees us as we really are. And he offers us the ability to see it too. By humbling ourselves and saying, yes, that's the standard. He is the standard. We were created to live up to the standard, and we don't. And so it is only good and loving and right for a judge who is the standard to judge all those who fail to meet the standard and to give them what they deserve. But the love goes even beyond that. And that's what the cross is about. That's what the gospel is. It's the good news. You can't live up to the standard, but you can be dependent on the standard. You can depend on God's grace and love and mercy to save you from this. I know we've heard it over and over, but we have to believe it every minute, every day. Otherwise, we run off in our own version of love. We run off in our own version of goodness and grace and mercy, and we say, yeah, look, I'm like God, but we're way over here. We make ourselves to be the standard. We say, no, I'm pretty good. Look at everybody else. They're way over there. We still are not looking at the standard. We could all be Clevises. That's how far off we are. God calls us sinners. We don't like it. But it's because we missed the mark. That's what sin means. We've missed the standard. What does Paul say to these believers? He knows God's going to complete it in them, but he still calls them to this. He wants their love to abound in real knowledge and discernment, so that they can approve the things that are excellent. How do you judge what's right and wrong? How do you determine for your life what action you should take today? What words you should speak? How do you do that? How can you come up with any kind of discernment that's good? The answer is you can't. I can't. We are not the standard. God is the standard. We have to be dependent on that standard. We've got to know him. We've got to be dependent. We've got to go to him and say, hey, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to say? What will meet your standard in this situation? How can I reflect your love and your goodness and your mercy and your grace and everything you are in this situation? How is it even possible? Some situations we get in are such a mess. Feels like there's no way up. There's no right choice here. And we lean on our own understanding. We lean on our own decision making and our own judgment and discernment. And often we make worse mess. You see, we're called to this standard. And God already calls us that He's already said we do meet this standard. In his judgment, we're saints, we're holy ones. We're just like him. We just haven't achieved it yet. It's coming. It's like if you were a prince. You're going to be king, but you're not yet. That's what you and I are. We're princes and princesses of God. We're going to be made like him when we see his son. Remember what we saw in chapter 2. How did Jesus determine good and evil? How did he determine love? How did he do what was right in this life, in this body, in his time? He depended on the standard. He humbled himself and obeyed. In every situation, in any moment, no matter what the situation was like around him, no matter if people were picking up rocks to stone him or nailing him to a cross, this was his standard. This is what we're called to. It's such a high calling, and it's such a good calling. I don't want to be called Clevis. I'm sure none of you want to be called Clevis either. I want to be called a child of the King. I want to be called a Christian because I deserve it, not because I call myself Christian, but because I look like a little Christ. Because I'm dependent on the Father, who's the standard. He says, this is so that you may approve the things that are excellent. You cannot approve what is excellent because you're not the definer of what's excellent. You can only say, yes, God, that is excellent, and agree with God. You can only approve. You can't make it up. You can't define it. You can't choose for yourself what's excellent. You have to be dependent on the one who declares what's excellent. At the end of the book, in in chapter 4, he comes back to this idea. And we'll go into it in more details in the future. But look at verse 8. Chapter 4, verse 8. We'll wrap up with this. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Imagine if you got to follow Paul, right? Paul was the planter of this church, and we got to spend time with him. We saw how he lived and what he said. He's saying, I'm following God that way, and I know you can follow me because I'm following God. Those things you saw me do, how I loved, how I suffered even for the gospel, how I helped others, how I did whatever you saw me, that's how you can follow. We all need to be aiming for that so that others can follow our life and our example and move towards godliness, move towards being like God. If that's not something we can say, if there's not some part of your life you can say, hey, well, you can follow me right here in this part. I'm not really great in other parts, but right here I'm doing really good. I know because I'm dependent on God. He's my standard. Then that's where you need to be. You need to be where you can call others to follow. That's discipleship. You disciple others to become like God in the areas you have learned from God. You have learned to become like God. Paul here is able to say, hey, all those things you saw in my life, do that. You'll be good. Keep going that way. Know God. The things you've heard from me, remember those. The things you saw in my life, live like that, and you'll be good. That's how easy it is to disciple somebody. You just have to become yourself and then let them hang around you. Let them see God's goodness, God's definition of love poured out through your life. It's not some mysterious thing that's hard that you have to go to seminary to learn to do. You just have to know the standard. So the question for many of us is, okay, well, how do I get to know this standard? You know, I've heard a little bit this morning. I've heard what he's like. How do I know him? That's part of God's love too. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, to become man so that you could see the standard lived out. You could see Jesus Christ, both God and man, united. Okay, he's not here today. So how do I get to know the Father? Because Jesus isn't here. You're right, he's not in a physical sense. But he has left us something even better than his physical sense. He has left us his Spirit. We don't believe that all the time. We wish Jesus was physically here. But Jesus says the Spirit's better. And if you accept God's plan, that we are broken, we cannot define good and evil, he is the standard, we need something to take us from here to there, and his plan is that Jesus Christ died on the cross to take you from here to there. And if you accept this for you, if you say, yes, I believe Jesus died for me, his death paid the penalty that the just judge was going to put on my account, then God declares you no longer here, but here. He declares you as righteous, as having lived perfectly up to the standard. As if you loved perfectly, as if you made all the decisions in your life right, as if you never hurt anybody. It's not your reality, but that's what he declares. If you do that, then God promises to create in you a new life. He promises to give you the Holy Spirit. The Spirit comes into our life, and it communes with us. It fellowships with us. It guides us. It tells us, hey, right now in this moment, that's not love. That's not what you should be doing. The Spirit comes into your life and he says, hey, remember the standard. Remember the standard. Remember the standard. He comes into your life and he says, hey, remember what Jesus taught you. Remember what you heard. Remember what you read. And he comes into your life and he constantly is taking you from here in every moment of your life to here. And he helps you, and he reminds you, and he prompts you, and he gives you the words you should say that would look like this instead of that. And so, you see, it's not your ability. It's nothing you can do to take you from here to there. It's all God's work. It's you being dependent on the Spirit. Just like you're dependent on Jesus Christ to save you, and just like you're dependent on the Father to be the standard. Once you're there, life gets fun and interesting and dangerous. Because God is leading now. The Spirit is guiding you. And so every step you take in life, you can let go. Remember that song, Jesus Take the Wheel? It's kind of like that. You can let go. And you can say, what do you want now? What do you want in this moment? And the Spirit comes and he guides. And sometimes he's like, go on, you can do it. Take a few steps. And as you take them, he comes alongside and he holds you up. Make sure you don't fall. And if you do fall, he picks you up and dusts you off. Like a good, loving Father. We need to have courage in our Christian lives to let go of our own standard, of our own decision-making, of how we define good and evil, of what we think is right and wrong. And we need to let God do it. And it's hard. It's actually harder than it sounds. Because we've done this for so much of our lives. This is what we're born into. This is all we know. And it takes real faith in the God who is the standard. For me, the difference was always the cross. If God loved me like that, if he was willing to become a man, to live and die for me, just to save me, to help me become like him, why would I not? Why would I not trust him? I'm going to trust everything he tells me. I'm going to trust every step he's leading me in. And so that's our call this morning. Trust the standard. You don't have to make up your own. Trust God as he is, not how you think he is. Learn him. Know him. Learn to approve his excellency. Learn to say, yes, that is good. Yes, you are loved. Yes, I want to be like that. That's all our job is. We just have to agree. We have to approve it. We have to say, yes, that's good, and that's evil. I don't have to go over here and do all that work and figuring out for myself. I just have to agree. As we do this in our lives, you and I will be in unity. You and I will agree about the same things. If there's division and struggles amongst us, it's not because we're believing the standard, it's because we've made up our own. If there's anywhere in the church where we're starting to fight or not get along with each other, or we're in disagreement about things, it's because we're making up our own standards. want to see Thaxton Baptist Church thrive. Let God be the standard. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much that you have revealed yourself to us through Jesus Christ. I pray that we would long and desire to know you, that you would help us to have true knowledge of you, not just knowledge about you, but an intimate knowledge of having been with you, of having been indwelled by your Spirit. I pray that if there are any here who have not been given new life, who do not know your Spirit, you would call to them with your good, loving voice, and that they would hear you. I pray that you would call to them, that you would tell them you want them to be yours. You want them as your prince and your princess. I pray that you would humble them, help them to respond to your calling. Help them to allow you to be the standard instead of struggling and fighting to make up their own. Help them to move from just a version of morality to righteousness. You know my words can do nothing apart from your Spirit. I pray that your Spirit would come and work, that it would work in the hearts of those even who are online. We know that you can do all things. This is the reason Jesus died. And so in his name